The Supreme Court just slapped Trump's tariffs, and it's bigger than you think. Right now, as you're watching this, the United States is in the middle of one of the most consequential legal and economic battles in modern American history. And most people have no idea how deep this rabbit hole actually goes. What happened on Friday wasn't just another political headline to scroll past. The Supreme Court of the United States, the highest court in the land, just told the most powerful president in the world, no, you can't do that. And the shockwaves from that decision are going to ripple through your wallet, through global markets, through the entire architecture of American trade policy for years to come. But here's where it gets really interesting. Because buried inside this story is a Supreme Court justice publicly breaking from the majority in a way that lit the internet on fire. A president taking to social media to call that justice his new hero. Billions of dollars potentially owed in refunds, and trade deals worth trillions hanging by a thread. So let's slow down. Let's actually go inside this story. Because what's happening right now is not just politics, it's history unfolding in real time. Let's start at the very beginning, because to understand why this Supreme Court decision is such a massive deal, you have to understand the law at the center of all of this. It's called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA for short, and it is one of the most powerful, most controversial, and most misunderstood pieces of legislation in the entire United States Code. IEEPA was passed in 1977. It was designed to give the President of the United States emergency powers to regulate international commerce during times of national crisis. Think about what that means. In theory, if the country is facing a genuine threat from abroad, whether that's a hostile foreign power, a catastrophic economic attack, or a national security emergency, the president can act fast, act decisively, and regulate the flow of goods, services, and money crossing American borders without waiting for Congress to debate and vote and argue for months. For decades, IEEPA was used sparingly. It was treated like a fire extinguisher on the wall. You know it's there, you hope you never need it, but when there's a real fire, you're glad it exists. Presidents used it to freeze assets of foreign governments, to cut off financial ties with regimes like Iran and North Korea, to respond to genuine, specific, documented crises. Then came Donald Trump. And Trump looked at IEEPA and saw something completely different. He saw a weapon. Last year, Trump made a decision that stunned economists, legal scholars, foreign governments, and even many of his own advisors. He decided to use IEEPA, this emergency law, to impose sweeping tariffs on virtually every country on the planet. Not targeted, surgical tariffs on specific goods from specific adversarial nations. We're talking across-the-board tariffs, blanket taxes on imports from allies and enemies alike, a fundamental restructuring of how America trades with the entire world, done not through Congress, not through years of negotiation, not through the traditional legislative process, but through an executive declaration of national emergency. His justification? Two things. First, the flood of illicit drugs, particularly fentanyl, pouring into the United States from China, Mexico, and Canada. Second, what he called a chronic trade deficit that had hollowed out American manufacturing and devastated working-class communities across the country. Now, whether you agree with those justifications or not, what Trump was arguing, what his legal team was arguing, was that IEEPA gave him the authority to respond to those threats however he saw fit, and that included tariffs. Massive, economy-shaking tariffs, implemented overnight, without a single vote in Congress. That argument worked, for a while, but not everyone was convinced, and that's where the courts came in. The legal challenges came fast, and they came from everywhere. Importers, businesses, foreign governments, legal advocacy groups. The core question was simple but profound. Does IEEPA actually give the president the power to impose tariffs, or is that a step too far? Because here's the thing. IEEPA gives the president broad authority to regulate international transactions in an emergency. It lists specific powers, the ability to block transactions, freeze assets, impose embargoes, restrict trade. But tariffs? The law doesn't specifically say tariffs, and that gap, that silence in the text, became the fault line on which this entire legal battle was fought. Courts at the lower levels began ruling against the administration. The legal consensus was building that IEEPA, however powerful, was not a blank check. that using it to impose massive global tariffs was a stretch too far, a president grabbing power that the Constitution actually reserves for Congress. Because let's be clear about something. The power to impose tariffs under the Constitution belongs to Congress, not the president. Congress can delegate that authority to the president under certain conditions, but can it delegate it this broadly? That's the question. And when the case finally reached the Supreme Court of the United States, the answer was no. The vote was 6-3, in a decision that crossed traditional ideological lines, because this wasn't a simple liberal versus conservative split. The majority of the Supreme Court ruled that Trump's use of IEEPA to impose sweeping emergency tariffs exceeded his authority under the law. Think about what that means. 6 justices, including several appointed by Republican presidents, including justices who have historically been sympathetic to broad executive power, looked at what Trump did and said, "This goes too far." The ruling was immediate in its impact. Tariffs that had been generating billions of dollars in revenue, that had been reshaping supply chains, that had been sending shockwaves through global markets for months, suddenly invalidated, struck down by the highest court in the country. Trump's response was swift. He called it a shame. He took to Truth Social. He expressed his outrage. But then, and this is where the story takes a turn that almost nobody saw coming, he praised one of the justices who voted against him. Brett Kavanaugh, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, appointed by Donald Trump himself in 2018, confirmed after one of the most brutal, controversial Senate hearings in modern American history. A justice that Trump fought hard for, believed in, and saw as part of his legacy. Kavanaugh voted with the majority. He sided with the 6 justices who struck down the tariffs. But he didn't just vote against the administration quietly. He wrote a dissenting opinion. Wait, let's be precise here because this is important. He agreed with the outcome, but wrote, separately, to explain that he thought the majority's reasoning was flawed. He believed the tariffs should have been struck down, but for different reasons than his colleagues articulated. And in that separate opinion, Kavanaugh said something that caught Trump's eye. Something that, in the middle of all this legal drama, actually gave Trump something to hold on to. Kavanaugh called the majority's interpretation of IEEPA illogical. He pointed out what he saw as a glaring inconsistency in their reasoning. According to the majority's interpretation, he wrote, the president could block all imports from China entirely, an embargo, but couldn't impose a tariff of even $1 on Chinese goods. He argued that made no sense, that the law doesn't draw such a sharp, strange distinction between embargoes and tariffs on one hand and more flexible trade tools on the other. And crucially, critically, Kavanaugh wrote that the decision, despite striking down the IEEPA tariffs, was unlikely to substantially restrict the president's ability to impose tariffs going forward, because, he noted, there are many other federal laws that give the president tariff authority. IEEPA isn't the only tool in the toolbox. It was simply the one the administration had chosen to use, and the one the court found insufficient. Trump read that opinion and immediately declared Kavanaugh his, quote, new hero. Along with Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, the 2 justices who voted with the minority to uphold the tariffs entirely, Trump celebrated Kavanaugh's dissent as evidence that the justice understood the mission, understood what he called the project of making America great again. It was a remarkable moment, a president praising a justice who technically ruled against him, because the way that justice explained his vote gave the administration a roadmap forward. But here's what Trump's enthusiasm might be glossing over. Because there's a paragraph in Kavanaugh's opinion that isn't getting nearly enough attention, and it should be, because it might be the most consequential thing written in that entire ruling. Kavanaugh acknowledged, clearly and without ambiguity, that the Supreme Court's decision could have massive short-term consequences. He wrote that the United States might be forced to refund billions of dollars to importers who paid the IEEPA tariffs. Billions, with a B. Think about what that means practically. Companies that imported goods from China, from Europe, from Asia, from South America, companies that paid those tariffs month after month, could now be legally entitled to get that money back. The government collected it. The court says it shouldn't have. So now what? And Kavanaugh himself flagged the complexity. Some of those companies, he noted, already passed those costs on. They raised their prices. They charged their customers more. The tariff burden didn't stay with the importer. It was pushed downstream, to retailers, to consumers, to you. So if the importer gets a refund, but the consumer already paid the price, who gets the money back? How do you untangle that? The justice called the refund process likely very complex. That might be the understatement of the decade. We're talking about one of the most logistically nightmarish financial unraveling scenarios the federal government has ever faced. Customs records going back months, thousands of companies, millions of individual shipments, a refund process that has never been designed at this scale. And then there's the other shoe dropping, the one that goes beyond domestic politics and domestic refunds and hits the global economy directly. Kavanaugh also wrote that the ruling could create massive uncertainty around what the Trump administration had been calling landmark trade agreements, deals described as being worth trillions of dollars in economic value, agreements with China, with the United Kingdom, with Japan, deals that were negotiated in the shadow of these tariffs, as leverage, as bargaining chips, deals where foreign governments made concessions, or were expected to, in exchange for tariff relief. If the tariffs that created the leverage were never actually legal in the first place, what happens to the deals built on top of them? Are those agreements still valid? Do foreign governments have a right to renegotiate? Do they walk away entirely? This isn't a hypothetical. China, the United Kingdom, Japan, these are three of the most economically powerful entities on the planet. The trade relationships at stake here represent an almost incomprehensible volume of goods, services, investment, and financial flows. And the Supreme Court just yanked out a foundational pillar of the negotiating framework. And then, as if the story couldn't get more complicated, Trump didn't wait. He didn't pause to absorb the ruling, to consult with Congress, to let the dust settle. The very next day, he raised tariffs again, this time using a completely different legal authority. Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, a law that explicitly authorizes the president to impose tariffs, up to 15%, under specific economic conditions. Trump took the tariff rate from 10%, where it had been set after the court's ruling temporarily froze things, up to 15%, a direct signal that he wasn't backing down, that he was simply going to find a different road to the same destination. And that, right there, is the most important thing to understand about where we are right now. The court didn't end the tariff era. It didn't tell Trump he can never impose tariffs. It told him he used the wrong legal tool. And Trump, and his administration, are already reaching for other tools. Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent went on television and argued that the court's decision was, paradoxically, a strengthening of Trump's position. Because now, the tariffs that get imposed will be on cleaner, more defensible legal ground. The administration's critics might call that spin, but there's a kernel of legal logic in it. If the court rules that IEEPA doesn't authorize tariffs, but the Trade Act of 1974 does, then tariffs imposed under the Trade Act are on much stronger footing, harder to challenge, more durable. So let's zoom all the way out, because I want to make sure you understand what this moment actually is. This is a story about the balance of power in American government, about who decides trade policy, the president acting alone, or Congress legislating. The founders gave Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations for a reason. They were deeply suspicious of concentrating too much power in a single executive. The entire architecture of the Constitution was designed to prevent any one person from having unchecked authority over the economic life of the nation. What Trump tried to do with IEEPA was push that architecture to its absolute limit. He argued that an emergency, the drug crisis, the trade deficit, justified concentrating that authority in his hands. 6 justices said that argument went too far. But here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody on either side wants to fully acknowledge. The underlying problems Trump was pointing to, they're real. The fentanyl crisis is real. The hollowing out of American manufacturing is real. The trade deficit with China is real. Whether tariffs are the right solution to those problems is a separate debate. Economists argue passionately on both sides, but the problems themselves aren't invented, which means that even if the legal mechanism gets cleaned up, even if the administration finds the right statutory authority to impose these tariffs, the deeper political and economic fight is not going away. It's just changing shape. And in the middle of all this, the legal drama, the billions in potential refunds, the trillion-dollar trade deals hanging in uncertainty, the president rage posting on Truth Social, There is a man in a black robe named Brett Kavanaugh, a man who went through one of the most searing public confirmations in Supreme Court history, a man whose appointment was arguably the defining judicial battle of Trump's first term, a man who, in this moment, voted against the administration on the outcome, but wrote the kind of opinion that gave the president something to tweet about. That relationship, between a president and the justices he appoints, is one of the most fascinating, unpredictable, and often disappointing dynamics in American political life. Presidents appoint justices expecting loyalty. The Constitution is specifically designed to ensure they don't get it. Justices serve for life, free from political pressure, accountable to no one. And yet, here we are, with Trump calling Kavanaugh his, quote, new hero, not because Kavanaugh ruled in his favor, but because the way Kavanaugh ruled against him still left a door open, still gave the president a narrative, still pointed toward a path forward. In politics, and especially in this administration, that counts for a lot. Here's where things stand right now, and why you need to keep watching this story closely. The tariffs are not over. They are changing form. Trump is already operating under different legal authority, with a new 15% global tariff rate. Legal challenges to those tariffs are certainly coming. The courts will have to weigh in again. Congress is being forced, whether it wants to be or not, to confront questions about how much tariff authority it has delegated to the executive branch, and whether it should claw some of that back. The refund question is going to become a political and economic crisis of its own. Billions of dollars, complex accounting, consumers who already paid and can't be made whole, companies trying to navigate customs law and reimbursement claims simultaneously. This isn't going to be resolved quickly or quietly. The trade deals, the ones with China, the UK, Japan, are now operating in legal and diplomatic fog. Foreign governments have to decide whether the agreements they negotiated are still worth the paper they're written on, or whether the changed legal landscape gives them leverage to reopen talks. Some will see opportunity, some will see chaos. Both reactions will have consequences. And hovering over all of it is a fundamental constitutional question that this Supreme Court ruling raises without fully answering. In the 21st century, when trade is geopolitical power and economic interdependence is a fact of global life, who should have the authority to make sweeping decisions about America's place in the world economy? A president who can act in hours, or a Congress that deliberates in months? There is no clean answer to that question, but it is the most important question in American economic policy right now, and the fight over the answer is just getting started. This is not a story that ends with the Supreme Court ruling. This is a story that's just entering its most consequential chapter. The decisions being made right now, in courtrooms, in the Oval Office, in foreign ministries in Beijing and London and Tokyo, are going to shape American prosperity, American global standing, and the everyday economic reality of ordinary Americans for a generation. Stay with this story, because the surface-level headlines, Supreme Court blocks tariffs, Trump raises tariffs again, Kavanaugh writes dissent, those are just the opening frames. The real picture is deeper, stranger, more consequential, and more uncertain than any single headline can capture. And when the next development breaks, and it will break soon, you'll want to already understand what you're looking at.